The problem is that rapidly changing economic news, in my view, it's the new COVID. To me, it reminds me exactly of what we dealt with in COVID-19. And there was a number of things bullets that I put together to substantiate that idea. One is that the events are a shock. They're impossible to predict. We wake up in the morning and we find out what the new reality is. There's a shifting playing field and shifting rules just like COVID. I remember in COVID, we were open one day, we were closed the next. We couldn't show houses, we could show houses. It was changing all the time. And whenever we have that, and remember this initially in COVID-19, we were all biting our fingernails thinking we were out of business. At least I was, and thinking we were really going to have some challenges. And what happened then and what's happening now is consumers get really nervous about large ticket purchases. And then bad news starts to outpace good news, and businesses do what we call put your pencils down. It's interesting. I was watching CNBC on today's Wednesday, on Monday, and Austin Goolsbee, who is the president, chief executive officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, I should say, Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. He was relating a meeting that he had with top Illinois business people. And he said, these are developers, big real estate developers. These were big manufacturing companies in Illinois, in the Midwest. And he said that what they reported, the businesses, was that they put their pencils down. And Mr. Goolsbee asked him, what does that mean? What does put your pencils down mean? And they said, we've stopped investing. And the CNBC interviewer said, what was the cause of that? Was the cause of it uncertainty? And Mr. Goolsbee said, no, it's not uncertainty at all. He goes, we're quite certain that things are going to change daily. And he said, we can't live in a market or in an environment where that happens. And so that's really causing a lot of pressure on consumer confidence, and it's having an impact on markets. And it's really interesting because the impact is really geographic. But I think at the end of the day, the impact is going to be the same for all of us. So one of the things I want to make sure that you don't fall into the trap of doing is saying the inventory isn't rising. I'm in Saskatchewan in Canada. The inventory isn't rising for us. Or I'm in upstate New York. My gosh, in Rochester, there's 10 offers on every listing. We don't have to worry about that. It's interesting. Back to Illinois, I had a meeting on Tuesday with a large broker in Chicago. And Chicago was in two markets I want to talk about in this vein, Chicago and actually I'll talk about three markets: Calgary in Alberta, Chicago, Illinois, and Columbus, Ohio. All three of those markets were very active until last month. And usually those markets are bulletproof. Particularly Calgary can be a bit cyclical, but it was on fire. Certainly Columbus and Chicago, Illinois is usually the last market to enter into any kind of change, and Columbus is usually bulletproof. MLS sales in Columbus last month were down 15%, and Chicago inventory is up 35% in the last 30 days. And so you start to see the trend permeating. And what the reason that becomes a challenge, a problem that we have to solve, is because agents just aren't used to that market. We're just not used to this level of uncertainty and this level of inventory in the market. So I've got some solutions. I've got four solutions that I want to present to you. And everything revolves around communication, communicate. And the first thing we've got to do is acknowledge the problem. Our agents all know it exists. And so we've got to acknowledge, hey, what is the challenge here? Number two is we've got to communicate our short-term and long-term view. It's interesting is agents don't necessarily have a view. And I equate it to going into your stockbroker's office. And Derek goes into a stockbroker's office. And he goes, what do you think is going to happen in the stock market? And the broker goes, I don't know. I was in an office recently in the last couple of weeks, and I said, what do you think is going to happen in the real estate market with prices? And the agent said, well, interest might go up, but it might go down. And there was like five points, they said, that had no cohesive outcome. And I can tell you this, I would not have bought. It would be like me walking out of my stock or Derek walking out of stockbroker's office going, oh my gosh, I'd never buy. And so they need to have a short-term and long-term view on the market, no matter geographically how you're impacted. We've got to give our agents buy-side communications, and we got to give them sell-side communications, right? And so depending on where you are in the countries, there's different problems. But here's what I see as the problems we need to acknowledge. Some consumers may want to wait and see how they're personally affected. If they're in manufacturing states or manufacturing provinces, they're going to be a lot more shy, a lot more fearful of their job situation and how the current trade war is going to impact them. Some consumers want to wait and see how price and selection are affected, and I'm going to talk specifically to that. We may see some short-term unemployment increase, depending again on which side of the 49th parallel you sit and which state you're in. And the other thing that's really compounding this in both countries is the level of non-mortgage debt is making the situation worse. I read a statistic about a week ago that in the month of May, it was a record number of 90-day delinquencies in the Ontario mortgage market. And of course, Ontario is the largest market in Canada. So that was the largest number of delinquencies. Let's be clear here, the largest number of delinquencies since Equifax started collecting data. And when somebody gets in Canada, when somebody gets 90 days behind rather in their payments, that is the point at which you pass the point of no return. Now the bank is starting to issue paperwork, and you're probably another 3-4 months before those power sales, those foreclosures start to hit the market. And so that's making the situation worse. In the United States, we haven't seen that in mortgage payments, but I read an article again around the same period that in the month of May, it saw the highest number of auto defaults of automotive payments in the history of Equifax keeping track of automotive payments. And you might look at it and say, we're not in the auto business, or I don't sell real estate in Ontario, but here's the thing. It's to me, all of this is points in the same direction. They're all the canary in the coal mine. And we've all got to be super aware. If you haven't experienced some of these things yet, and I say yet, you want to get in front of them. And the last thing that we've seen is that the months of inventory in many markets has doubled. When I wrote this, it was several. It's many markets today. It started off at the end of last year in Florida and Texas and Arizona. Then it started to spread north and northeast. It's starting to move up through the Midwest, and certainly in Ontario and British Columbia, and now Alberta. Calgary's inventory doubled last month. It's starting to proliferate throughout the entire market. And so I think these are important things that agents need to realize, and they need to realize that as in the background of, hey, this is just a market. None of the things I've listed here are good news or bad news. It's just the market. There's some of my friends from Tennessee on the meeting today, and Steve, I love the way Bridget ends her sales meeting. And Steve's colleague Bridget says to her agents at the end of her sales meeting, so I'm at this sales meeting, and Bridget says at the end of the meeting, hey, what do we get paid for? And the agents all in unison say, to solve problems. And Bridget goes, great, then let's go solve some problems. Sorry, let's go find some problems. What do we get paid for? To solve problems. Great, then let's go find some problems. And that's really what we get paid for here, is solving problems. But these are generally problems that agents aren't used to. They're not used to seeing this. I've got a lot of friends on here. I'm looking at Paul Etherington's picture. Paul's been in the business as long as me, 40 years and then some, and a little bit. And we look at it and go, Michael Callis, oh, hey, we've been through this before, right? But our agents aren't. And I didn't research the statistic for today's presentation, but it's somewhere between 70 and 80% of the agents have not been in the market 15 years. If you haven't been in the market 15 years, I'm going to respectfully submit you're brand new. None of this, you don't know what a price reduction is. You have no idea how to explain to a seller they got to reduce their price, right? Or if you're in a seller's market, explaining to people in Rochester why they have to compete with 10 or 15 offers, right? And so these are all solutions that we've got to give to our agents if we're leading people in uncertain times. And so number two is I said, hey, we got to communicate our short-term view and our long-term view. And I'm going to communicate my short-term and long-term view. You need to come up with your own. Your agents need to have their own. I think you're going to have 6, maybe 12 max, 6 to 12 months of great buying opportunities, great selection at the right price. Or if you're in one of the very few markets that are still low inventory, a great price and a quick sale. But mostly, most markets are in the top, great buying opportunities. And long term, the economy is going to emerge stronger than ever. And I think what's really important to have agents be able to communicate is that real estate always goes up. I would say there's three things that are guaranteed in life: death, taxes, and real estate goes up. And but here's the problem, and this gets to the third communication strategy. The problem is that real estate always goes up in the long term, but doesn't always go up in the short term. And so what people, when you turn on the news or and you're talking to me, I'm reading national statistics, and in the US the other day was reading Ontario statistics, and it's all talking about the next few months. And it's talking about, hey, nationally, housing sales are down year over year. It's short term. And so what ends up happening, and this is something to really get across to your agents, that buyers go through this mindset, right? Where they change from what I call inflationary thinking to deflationary thinking. And it's a really simple change. What happens in inflationary thinking is that people think that, hey, if I don't buy today, I'm gonna have to pay more tomorrow. In deflationary thinking, they think, hey, if I don't buy today, it's going to be worth less than tomorrow. I'm going to save money by holding out. And we've got to get them back to long term thinking, because the reality is that the average person today owns real estate or is in the real estate market for roughly 40 to 50 years. And if they buy today, first time buyer, depending on where you are, what state, province you're in, it's somewhere between 33 and 36, let's say 35. You're going to be in the market till you're 85. That's 50 years, 75 at worst. That's 40 years. And we've got to get people thinking long term. And there's a saying that I have for our agents in this kind of market, and that is this: that that's part of the communication. We've got to stop selling houses and get back to selling real estate. And so before somebody goes and looks at a house, let's talk to them about the value of investing in real estate. And this is a 10-year. I've got two graphs I want to share with you that are things that I think that you ought to give your agents. And I just created these as a sample. You obviously need ones that are local to your market. But I've got both a Canadian and a US example. This is the 10-year price of Canadian real estate from the Canadian Real Estate Association. I only have access, I'm not a member of any of the boards. I don't have access to longer term data. But you can see over 10 years, even though the last few years have not been kind, that we're still up. And in fact, the price of the average property in Canada is went from 416,000 to 703,000, which is $287,000 in profit. Now, God bless AI. I used to have to run a spreadsheet to do this. I just went to AI and I said, hey, if I bought in 2015 and sold, sorry, 20, yeah, and sold in 2025, what's my compounded annual rate of return? And so the compounded annual rate of return is 5.36, which isn't great. It's okay, but I get to live there, but it's not great. But here's what I want to show you. If you put 20% down, you invested 104,000. And we call this your return on invested capital, your ROIC. You had 287,000 increase in value. You actually compounded 14.21% and you got to live there. Yeah, pretty darn good, right? And here's the thing: if I talk to a buyer about this, and we get sold on real estate, and then all of a sudden there's a house and it should be cheaper, and I'm afraid that things are going to go down, I'm not going to care so much, because I know over a 10-year period of time, I'm making a 14.21% return, right? And that was a 10-year graph. This is my all-time favorite graph, this next one. And this is the graph of Erie, Pennsylvania. And why do I like Erie, Pennsylvania so much? This is one of my favorite illustrations. It's a 40-year visual exhibit that shows the price of real estate in Erie, PA. And the reason I like it so much is Erie, PA is one of the worst performing markets in North America. And in fact, today, does anybody know what the average price of a house is in Erie, PA? $185,000 today. And Erie's a nice town. They've got great employers. It's on Lake Erie, obviously, Erie. Even though it's the worst performing market in North America, have a look at that graph. it goes straight up. And so this is, and when you do this research on your town, it'll look exactly the same. And what I want your agents to be able to show the performance of your town's real estate because it's going to look the same or better. And part of what we said the problem was with buyers right now is deflationary thinking. When we expand our timeline, deflationary thinking is only if I'm thinking like so. If I expand my timeline, it's in real estate goes up. And make no mistake, in real estate, inflation is good, right? Nobody buys a house today because they want it to be worth less 10 years from now. Everybody wants to be worth more, right? And so to have that, it has to be inflated, right? And these are the kinds of tools that we need to equip our agents with. And the reality is that 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years, we didn't need these graphs. We didn't need this information, right? Because it was deflationary thinking, right? Hey, Tyler, if you don't buy today, going to be worth more tomorrow. You're going to pay more tomorrow, guarantee you. And so it was a simple conversation, right? Got to change the conversation for our agents. I want to do a couple of pro tips selling in a buyer's market. These are really key. I talk to a lot of brokers every day, and one of the things that I've realized is if your listing inventory is rising, your agents don't know how to manage listings, and they've never had to manage them. They just sell. And so there's a number of things that I wrote down here that are just, these are really top tips for agents, right? Make sure that they've got a recurring time to communicate with sellers every week. You want to do this for your own sanity because if they don't and they're not communicating with sellers, guess who gets the call? You do. And with the hardest time to talk to sellers and where agents today aren't trained to do so is when it's not selling. When I got a call and say, "Hey, Stephanie, we got to reduce the price. I'm sorry." And so they're just not trained to do that. So start off by teaching them at the listing presentation to set a weekly time. When I was an agent, I used to do it Mondays. Hey, I'll call you every Monday and give you an update. And every time I talk to the seller, every time I talk to the seller, but it started the listing presentation, I set up the possibility of a price adjustment. Start talking about price adjustment at the listing presentation. Hey, we'll give it a try at this. The average time in the market, if I'm in Florida right now, is 8 months. And remember this, Florida is a bellwether state. We tend to look at it, go, oh, that's their problem. They're in the south and as people migrate coming back north. Yeah, that's all true. But those guys are the leading edge. In '08, they were the leading edge and everything that occurred in Florida. And when we all looked at it and said, oh, it's all the condos and it's not going to happen to us, everything happened. Everything permeated across the country, right? So set up the possibility of price adjustments at the listing presentation, super important. And make sure that when you're listing, I'm just going to pop the rest of these up here, and make sure when they're listing below the last sale, they're used to being in a market where if the last sale was 600, they're listing at 629. If the last sale's at 600, they got to be listing at 589, right? They got to get in front of the price trend. Discuss price adjustments. There's only what you may or may not realize this, and your agents will not realize this. There are three reasons that listings don't sell. Just there's three most important things in real estate, right? Location. There's three reasons listings don't sell. Price, price, and price, right? Price sells everything. I don't care what the location is. It's on a busy street corner. I don't care if it doesn't show. Price sells everything, right? If it's not selling, it's because it's too high. And finally, at those meetings, you want to communicate all of the information, the number of showings, the number of offers, selling price of other listings. And if we don't have showings and we don't have offers, it's the price. And one of our great members in Ocala, Florida, and Central Florida in the Villages is Nancy Dykeman. Nancy got into real estate in 1972. And Nancy and I were talking about this, and this is the last point I want to make on this, and then we'll go to teaching your agents to sell at any market type. In the Florida market, we have an office in Sarasota, and so I watch and a home there, and so I watch the market a lot there. And I see the average price pretty high in Sarasota. And I see these $1 million listings, and I see adjustments coming through for 10,000, 12,000. What? Don't waste your time. And so I love what Nancy says, and here's Nancy's formula, and I would encourage you to adopt it. If there's no showings, it's a 10% adjustment. If there's showings and no offers, it's a 5% adjustment. That will be a winning formula for you, and one that Nancy's had a lot of experience with. And my formula has always been 5 to 10%, but I love the way she packages that. Make sure that your agents know whatever the market they're selling in. Make sure that they know how to communicate in those markets. I'm going to talk about a buyer's market. I'll focus on that because that's most of our markets. We talked about this, but make sure they're pricing in front of the market, below the last sale price. Three things that sell your listing: price and price. Price adjustments for me are a minimum 5%, and you have to over communicate with the sellers. The last thing you want to do, your agents want to do, is they see their cell phone and, oh my gosh, I ignore. And because, as I said, if they're not communicating with the seller, I know the next person the seller's going to call